Hello, my name is Ethan Higgins, and this is episode 1 of the Spanish Civil War podcast. Before I even started thinking about making this podcast, I was deeply interested in the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War is perhaps one of the most misunderstood and misrepresented conflicts of the 20th century. Like many of the events that defined interwar Europe, it is either largely ignored or woefully misunderstood. And many of those who care enough to study it are often more obsessed with their own ideological narrative as they are with the actual facts of the period. When the conflict is mentioned in more heavily circulated historical media, it is usually as a backdrop to the events of the Second World War. Considering that the war became one of the most ideological conflicts in the world, it's hard to fault the many otherwise sincere historians that have been misled by decades' worth of propaganda and poor journalism. Despite being a civil war, the conflict drew attention of committed partisans across the world, and continues to do so today. For many acolytes on the left, the conflict represents the dreams of utopia crushed under the heel of fascism. For those on the right, the war was a crusade in defense of Spain against the forces of Bolshevism, secularism, and modernity. And those are just two of the perspectives most widely circulated. Both sides of the conflict contained factions that, were the circumstances different, would have been utterly irreconcilable with one another. This was especially the case in Catalonia and the Basque Country, that saw movements initially united in a desire to gain regional autonomy fracture due to the ideological clashes brought on by the rise of the Second Republic and the Civil War. Much like how the American founding is at the center of political dialogue in the United States, with many of its core elements mythologized or misconstrued, the same applies to Spain today with its memory of the Civil War. The situation for foreign observers is further complicated by the fact that for several decades, the Francoist regime sealed many of the archives documenting the war. This left many non-Spanish researchers to draw from sources that were circulated by either the USSR or the Axis. As you can imagine, such sources disseminated by the two largest totalitarian regimes in history would be unlikely to provide an entirely accurate account of events. There has luckily been a renewed effort by publishers and academics alike to present a more well-rounded narrative of the war. I have posted the bibliography containing the sources I used on my WordPress, and I would highly recommend my listeners to read them. They have been instrumental, and without them, I probably wouldn't have gotten this project off the ground. The goal of this podcast is to set the record straight and provide a resource accessible to English speakers. Before we even get into the war itself, however, I need to establish some context and give a brief summary of Spanish history until 1923. The Spanish Civil War was a conflict that tore at the very fabric of Spanish society and national identity. Therefore, it is important to know the events that created the environment necessary for the war and the several factions that made up either side. From there, it will be much easier to construct a cohesive narrative of the war. Additionally, I would like to apologize in advance for any mispronunciations of the names and places I will be mentioning. Though I will work to improve over the course of the show, my Spanish is still very rusty, and I would ask that you all bear with me. Following the defeat of Carthage at the hands of the Romans in 201 BC, the Iberian Peninsula became a core part of the Roman world. The region of the peninsula that today holds Spain was then named the province of Hispania, where we derive the country's modern name. In the following centuries, Hispania gained an immense amount of Roman influence in language and culture, and even produced several emperors. When Constantine legalized Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, the new religion grew to prominence in Hispania, and gradually replaced the worship of the Roman pantheon and local deities. During the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Hispania was subjected to various invasions of Germanic tribes, until the invading Visigoths of 466 AD established permanent kingdoms in the region. Over the years, these pagan tribes gradually adopted Christianity and other customs of the much larger Romanized population. In 711, the Muslims of North Africa, known as the Moors, conquered the majority of these Visigothic kingdoms, and pushed the remaining back to the sparsely populated northern mountains of Spain. The new conquerors then established the Umayyad Caliphate, and named the area they now ruled over Al-Andalus, thus beginning the nearly 700 years of Muslim occupation of the Iberian Peninsula. While the Muslim conquest left a large mark on the local population, importing many Arabic words and phrases, the region would retain much of its Christian and Roman heritage. Over the centuries, the caliphate fractured into various warring states, while the Christian kingdoms in the north grew and began retaking the lands to the south. This gradual conquest would later be known by historians as the Reconquest, or Reconquista of Spain, and became central to the national identity of the region. While many of the Christian kingdoms that emerged over the course of the Reconquista would go to war nearly as frequently with each other as they would against their southern Muslim neighbors, the era would capture the national imagination of future Spaniards as a triumphal crusade of native Christianity over foreign heathens. As the rest of Europe would muster funds to launch expeditions in the far-off Holy Land, Spain found itself battling Muslims at its very gates. It was also during this period that the Assembly of Parliament, or in Spanish, the Cortes, of landholding nobles and clergy, became a key feature of Spanish politics. By the 1300s, after several centuries of intermittent warfare, the Christian kingdoms of Iberia regained control over most of the peninsula. It is widely agreed among historians that the marriage of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile marked the beginning of Spanish national history. Their union, in 1469, brought the various principalities and kingdoms of Iberia under a single sovereign. However, each region of the peninsula would continue to maintain many of their local customs and political structures, making the title of monarch ruler of all the Spains, rather than ruler of Spain. After the fall of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, in 1492, the royal couple famously hired Italian explorer Christopher Columbus to chart a trade route to India. Discovering instead the Americas, which stood between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, Columbus's voyage heralded a new age of Spanish expansion and wealth. When the Habsburg Charles V inherited the thrones of Spain, the reach of the Spanish Empire extended further into the New World. During his reign, Charles struggled to keep his territories in Europe as Holy Roman Emperor. Placing himself, and by extension his dominions, firmly on the side of Roman Catholicism during the Reformation, Charles fought to retain his realms against intransigent Protestant princes, rival Catholic rulers, and foreign Ottoman encroachment. After a long series of wars and negotiations, Charles split his domains between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family, and retired to a Spanish monastery in 1557, where he died shortly thereafter. Charles's successors continued to expand Spanish dominion into the New World, even penetrating Asia with the conquest of the Philippines. To aid their Austrian brethren, the Spanish Habsburgs waged numerous wars against the Ottoman Empire. Through these conflicts, the Spanish established several coastal fortresses along the North African coast to combat Ottoman-sponsored piracy, with Ceuta and Melilla being the only two still in Spanish hands today. Having secured their side of the Mediterranean and being the first to establish colonies in the New World, Spain grew immensely wealthy. In 1561, King Philip moved his court to the relatively unremarkable city of Madrid, forcing his nobility to move away from their local bases of support to curry favor with their king. Over the years, the city exploded in population and size, quickly becoming a cultural center for the country, rivaling the great cities of Barcelona and Seville. As Spain entered the 17th century, the country saw a considerable decline. Numerous wars with rival European powers, combined with an inefficient bureaucracy tasked with administering a global empire, caused Spain to gradually lose prestige among its international peers. When Charles II died with no apparent heir, the throne of the Spains was left vacant. This caused the claimants, the French Bourbon Philip of Anjou and the Habsburg Charles of Austria, to vie for the throne with the help of their international allies. Thus began the War of Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1701 to 1715. Though there are many fascinating details in this great power conflict, for our purposes there are really only two facts immediately relevant to the rest of the series. First, the war saw the island of Gibraltar, located on the southern tip of Spain, change hands to the British, and second, the Bourbon Philip of Anjou won, and consolidated the titles of King of Spain into one crown. This consolidation was done both to further secure the crown and to punish the states that allied with his enemies during the war, such as Catalonia. Philip's victory was important, as it placed the Spanish royal family under the Salic law of the Bourbons, which, unlike that of the Habsburgs, did not accept females in the line of succession. This will become relevant again when we get to the Carlist Wars. After the War of the Spanish Succession, the Kingdom of Spain would continue its decline, becoming eclipsed by France as the major power on the continent. Despite these setbacks, Spain still retained a large portion of her empire. That was until the paradigm shift that was the French Revolution happened. What started out in 1789 as an effort to reform the French absolutist monarchy into a more constitutional government, by 1792 had escalated into a radical republican revolution that saw the King of France executed and the nation of France at war with virtually all the monarchies of Europe. After going through a series of unstable governments and amassing several satellite states from her enemies, France returned to being a monarchy under Napoleon in 1804 when he crowned himself emperor. Maintaining a balance between the liberal ideals of the French Revolution while avoiding its excesses, such as the Reign of Terror that saw thousands of political prisoners executed, Napoleon created a new kind of monarchy, one not based solely on divine right to rule, but also dependent on the will of the people. In a few years, Napoleon gained hegemony over continental Europe. The only major power that remained opposed to French interests was Britain. Lacking a navy capable of establishing an effective blockade of the British Isles, Napoleon instead issued a proclamation forbidding all of continental Europe from trading with Britain. This left Britain's old ally, Portugal, as the only country to reject Napoleon's continental system. As a result, Napoleon led a joint invasion of Portugal with the help of Spain, which had by that point re-entered its alliance with France. During the invasion, the royal household of Spain became split on the matter of cooperation with France. The ruling King Carlos IV was in favor of working with France, whereas his son and heir to the throne, Ferdinand VII, was against further entanglement with French affairs. When this rift in policy between the father and son grew, Napoleon offered to mediate and invited them to Paris. Instead of resolving the conflict, however, the emperor imprisoned the two and made his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, King of Spain. Though Napoleon is rightfully regarded today as a master statesman in general, this was likely one of the biggest blunders in his professional career. While a good portion of Spain's urban intellectual elite supported the Bonapartist government, the majority of the country remained firmly against the French. The generals that had served the royal family refused to violate their oaths of fealty, while the rural peasants cared little for a foreign king reigning over them, much less a French one. The brutal measures employed by the French to secure their rule over the Iberian Peninsula inspired a war of national liberation among the Spanish people, who rallied behind their captive king Ferdinand VII. Later called the Peninsular War, the conflict saw the first protracted use of irregular warfare on European soil. The term guerrilla came from this conflict to describe the Spanish army's use of soldiers that would fight low-intensity skirmishes before dispersing into the countryside to avoid the much better trained and numerically superior French. Eventually, this Spanish ulcer in Napoleon's empire brought about a French defeat in 1814, where a joint British and Spanish army drove the French out of the country. In spite of the many excesses of the French regime, the occupation sparked a debate regarding reform among Spain's governing elite. The previously absolutist Kingdom of Spain received its first written constitution under Joseph Bonaparte, and many of the legal reforms offered by this new form of government, based on rule of law rather than the will of the sovereign, to be a vital step in modernizing Spain. When Ferdinand was returned to the throne, however, these hopes for national renewal were dashed. The restored king made enemies of both the liberals and conservatives in his court by rolling back many of the reforms implemented during his exile and retaining several government ministers who had served the Bonapartes. Having spent more than a decade leading the country under an independent Cortes, many officers saw themselves as an institution separate from the government and resolved to take the matters of state into their own hands. On January 1st, 1820, a group of officers led a coup that forced Ferdinand to restore the old constitution of 1812. These officers and the politicians they helped elevate to power became known to Spanish liberal circles as the exaltados, or exalted ones, and effectively marked the beginning of classical liberalism in Spanish government. This action would begin the trend of coups that would continue into the 20th century, when various Spanish military leaders seized power to reorganize the state in times of national crisis. The generals leading these coups were called caudillos, a term used to describe military leaders throughout the Spanish-speaking world who used their martial position to pursue political initiative. Over the course of the 19th century, the Spanish Empire abroad would continue to decline. Thoroughly preoccupied by the Peninsular War, Spain was unable to put down the various Latin American revolutions that erupted at around the same time. By 1825, most of the American colonies had been lost to wars of national independence. All that remained of Spain's overseas empire in the New World was Cuba and Puerto Rico. Meanwhile, at home, the kingdom approached a succession crisis. Having reached a tenuous compromise with the constitutionalists in his court, Ferdinand VII now faced the serious problem of providing a viable heir. With no children of his own, the king's younger brother, Don Carlos, was set to inherit the throne. Things changed, however, when Ferdinand's wife, Maria Cristina, gave birth to Isabella II in 1830. When Ferdinand abolished the Salic law in 1833, thereby reintroducing Isabella into the line of succession, then died, the stage was set for the First Carlist War. Though the question of succession was the inciting incident of the war, The ideological motives driving both sides of the conflict ran deeper. Those who supported Don Carlos's claim on the throne, known as the Carlists, tended to be more conservative and traditionally minded. They believed in the absolute authority of the monarch and the central role of the Catholic Church in Spanish political life. The supporters of Isabella, on the other hand, were more liberally inclined, with the majority hoping to create a more constitutionally based monarchy that shared power with the Cortes, and a minority that sought the abolition of the monarchy altogether and the creation of a secular republic. Faced with economic and societal turmoil that came with a modernizing Europe, both sides believed their solutions to be the best course of action for the Spanish state. After 6 years of brutal fighting that saw atrocities committed on both sides, the war came to an end in 1839 with the Peace of Vergara. In an attempt to maintain national cohesion after the war, many of the Carlist army officers were reintegrated into the military and retained the positions they held before the war. To ease further tensions, General Ramon Maria Narvaez, advisor to the new Queen Isabella, began politically restructuring the country. Under his guidance, the national bureaucracy was expanded, and additional power given to local political bosses. Faced with the labor unrest brought on by the industrialization of Spain, the Civil Guard was created in 1843 to maintain public order and defend the monarchy. While many idealists decried the lack of actual democratic power in this new order, the majority of the Spanish populace was satisfied with the window dressing of parliamentary politics. So long as their livelihoods were protected and stability was preserved, they remained largely content. From the 1840s to the 1860s, things remained relatively stable and peaceful. The only major conflict of the period was a second but brief Carlist war limited to Catalonia. While the revolutions of 1848 rocked the rest of the continental European monarchies to their core, Spain was virtually unaffected. Though control of the government would change hands from liberals and conservatives through various coups, the policies pursued by both remained functionally the same. Careful and measured reform was the primary goal of the government during those turbulent times. This attitude was particularly reflected in the government's nuanced dealings with the Church. In 1851, the Navarre's government reached a new concordat with the Vatican that granted the Church more power in public life in exchange for recognition of church property that had been secularized. In 1857, public education was established, but with a particular preference for Roman Catholic doctrine. The objective of the government was to bring Spain into the modern world without abandoning its ancient and venerated traditions. By the 1860s, Spain, which had previously been one of the most rural and agrarian countries in Western Europe, had reached a population of over 16 million. So unlike the rest of Europe, which had already suffered their various social upheavals around food scarcity in the 1840s, Spain didn't have its food riots until 1866 when a recession hit. These disruptions in stable government were made worse by the fact that the Kingdom of Spain soon faced yet another succession crisis. Isabella II's many affairs were public knowledge, and her husband, Francis, Duke of Cadiz, was widely suspected of being a homosexual. This combination placed immediate doubt about the legitimacy of her heirs, which threatened to undo all the careful effort that had gone into smoothing over the tensions that had built up over previous decades. Things were further exacerbated by the widening gap between rich and poor, as a largely agrarian people struggled to adapt to the changing economic needs of an industrializing Spain. The remedy devised by Spain's elite for the problem was, of course, another coup. On September 19, 1868, Isabella was ousted from power by a junta led by Generals Juan Prim and Francisco Serrano. Isabella and her supporters, fearing that they might incite a civil war, fled into exile with no formal announcement of abdication. The government quickly established a regency that planned to give the future potential monarch only ceremonial powers, with the Cortes acting as the most powerful body. Also, for the first time in Spanish history, universal manhood suffrage was instituted, greatly expanding the voting population of the country. When the regency started looking for a monarch, they initially accepted the rule of Leopold of Hohenzollern. This, however, led to the Franco-Prussian War, since Leopold had pro-Prussian sympathies, and France, then under the rule of Napoleon III, could not allow a provocation of installing a ruler friendly to their rival to go unchallenged. With Leopold no longer a viable candidate, the regency then looked to the Italian Victor Emmanuel II of Savoy as their new king. Victor accepted, and in 1870 he arrived in Spain, where he was crowned Amedio I. Meanwhile, in France, Isabella II, after considerable pressure from her supporters in exile, abdicated the throne in favor of her son Alfonso XII. Immediately after taking power, Amedio regretted his decision. Support for his reign was divided by the news of Alfonso's candidacy that caused the monarchists to reconsider their positions. and the left side of the coalition that had ousted Isabella wanted to scrap the monarchy altogether and create a republic. Amedio faced further trouble from forces outside his own government. When the French Commune seized power in Paris in 1871, radical leftists in Spain were emboldened and increased their attacks on government officials and property. And just to make matters worse, on the 21st of April, 1872, a third Carlist war was launched by Carlos VII. Faced with dwindling support and surrounded by enemies on all sides, in 1873, Amedio abdicated. With the throne vacant, the Republicans in the Cortes seized the opportunity, and in the same year that Amedio abdicated, they proclaimed the First Spanish Republic. However, this change in government did virtually nothing to solve the crippling problems that faced Spain. The factionalism that had hampered the monarchy continued to hamper the new republic. After 4 presidents, several regionalist insurrections, and little to no progress made on resolving the crisis, on January 3, 1874, the military took over again. Despite the fact that Serrano did not want the Bourbons restored to power, believing them to be as equally incapable of guiding the ship of state as the Republicans, the rest of his colleagues disagreed. Nearly a year after dissolving the Cortes, on December 4th, General Arnaizo issued a new proclamation asking for the return of Alfonso XII. The Bourbon king, who at that time was studying in England, accepted the invitation and was crowned on December the 29th. Having suffered through several years of civil conflict, the people were generally welcoming to the restored Bourbons, and their optimism was soon rewarded, as by 1876, Alfonso had defeated the Carlists and helped usher in a new constitution. Alfonso's political program was designed to appeal to nearly all sectors of Spanish society, promising democratic parliamentary government, rule of law, and secular public education that still maintained respect towards the church. Though, like most monarchs in the era, Alfonso and his wife had to dodge several assassination attempts from radical anarchists, the monarchy enjoyed a great deal of public support. Alfonso XII died in 1885, and his wife, Maria Cristina, gave birth to their first son, Alfonso XIII, the following year. Maria continued to carry on her husband's legacy, acting as a steward of parliamentary government during her time as regent. Under her regency, the crown maintained an apolitical stance, and instead worked to be a symbol of unity for a fractious Spain. By allowing conservatives and liberals democratic participation in a bicameral parliament, the larger political factions in Spain found more benefit in cooperating with the existing system than trying to establish a new political order. When fringe ideological groups began popping up, such as El Socialista Obrero Español, the Socialist Workers' Party of Spain, from here on referred to as the PSOE, and El Unión General de Trabajadores, the General Union of Workers, from here on referred to as the UGT, they were largely relegated to the outskirts of Spanish politics. It would take decades for either to gain any real significance in government. While Spain seemed to have its domestic affairs finally under control, foreign developments were another story. After a Cuban insurrection broke out, politicians and journalists in the United States began accusing Spain of unmatched cruelty in their efforts to suppress the rebellion. So in 1898, with the U.S. intent on demonstrating its growing military prowess, and many of Spain's officers hoping to participate in a major engagement to gain promotions, both sides eagerly went to war. Initially, many observers thought the struggle between the two powers would see fighting all along the Gulf of Mexico. Instead, the conflict would prove to be one of the most humiliating wars in Spanish history. During the war, Spain's Pacific and Atlantic fleets were virtually annihilated by the better trained and equipped American Navy. The fighting on land wasn't much better, with the undersupplied Spanish garrisons dying far more from tropical diseases than actual combat with the enemy. In the end, the Spanish-American War saw Spain lose the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, the last remnants of her once massive global empire. The only territory outside the Iberian Peninsula held by Spain after the war were a few islands in the Mediterranean and a portion of Morocco. The Spanish-American War helped inspire a period of deep self-reflection on the problems facing the nation. When Alfonso XIII turned 17 in 1902 and took his full powers as king, there was a renewed effort by liberals and conservatives to modernize Spain up to the same level as its European peers. In the wake of the disillusionment caused by the war, anarchism began to gain some traction among the lower classes, who looked for ways to gain better working conditions. Zealous radicals committed public assassinations and bombings that resulted in government crackdowns. The largest of these anarchist groups would unite to form the National Confederation of Work, o Confederación Nacional de Trabajo, from now on referred to as the CNT, and operated on a semi-covert level as they were outlawed between 1910 to 1912. It was during this period of rising political violence that José Carnales, the prime minister, was assassinated by an anarchist. This act of terrorism effectively put an end to reform, as the Cortes assembled a few times just to maintain basic governance. Despite the standstill in government, the Spanish economy did remarkably well in the years that followed. During the First World War, from 1914 to 1917, Spain maintained a neutral stance towards the combatants. This neutrality gave the country the opportunity to pay off its foreign debtors and trade with both sides. This turn in good fortune, however, did not last long. When the war concluded, events abroad threatened the stability of Spain by revitalizing the fringe political movements that had previously been unable to gain a solid footing. The first was the publication of American President Woodrow Wilson's 14-point speech that advocated for national self-determination of minorities in post-war Europe. Such a proposal emboldened nationalist movements in Catalonia and the Basque Country, who renewed their efforts to achieve autonomy. Next, when the February Revolution in 1917 saw Russia's Tsar deposed in favor of a republic, Spanish Republicans pushed for their own change in government. Hoping to replicate the success of the Russians, the Republicans encouraged workers' strikes that brought the economy to a crawl. Then, when the Bolsheviks took power in October that same year, demanding that socialist organizations around the world recognize Moscow as the head of the Third International, it caused a minority in the PSOE to split off into its own pro-communist party, forming El Partido Comunista España, the Spanish Communist Party, which I will from here on refer to as the PCE. Meanwhile, a new insurgency in Morocco erupted, led by the charismatic Abdul el-Karim. These rebels launched their attacks on the poorly fed and under-equipped garrisons stationed in the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. Faith in the government's ability to handle the situation was shattered when on July 21st, 1921, the Spanish army was defeated by the rebels, resulting in the deaths of 15,000 men along with their commander, General Silvestre. In response to this humiliation, the liberal government, which had been critics of the army, announced a new wave of conscriptions that further agitated the general population. With public confidence at an all-time low, General Miguel Primo de Rivera issued a pronouncement in September 1923, calling for a change in government to face the current crisis. And that is where I will leave off for today's episode. In our next episode, we'll dive into the life of Miguel Primo de Rivera and explore how his dictatorship both put an end to the civil unrest that rocked Spain and, in some ways, set the stage for the rise of the Second Spanish Republic. It will also give me the chance to give a more in-depth look at Catalonia and the Basque Country as we approach the multifaceted political landscape of the Civil War. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Adios.